you have to wonder, are a lot of people wrong a lot of the time? And if so, why? And why don't they know it so often? Why don't we know it in general so often? It seems to me, if you have a grossly incorrect perception of reality and act upon it, in past days, say 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or even earlier in life, you would suffer for it. Kind of like jumping off a cliff. Well, you're probably acting on something quite fallacious as to reality, like thinking there's a net 2 inches below where you drop or jump, and yet there isn't. You're going to pay a price. You'll fall and probably break your neck at the minimum. In other words, there are painful consequences in past days to a very inappropriate perception of reality. And so we could not go for very long without others knowing that our reality is quite incorrect, and ourselves perceiving that fact too. There would be, again, consequences. But what of reality, then, that doesn't have bad consequences these days especially? How are we to know, then, without any kind of negative feedback, really what we're talking about here, as to our grip on reality, and thus whether we're correct about something or not? For if there's no feedback, how can we know anything really about whether something is true or false? Everything then can become quite wishy-washy. For consider, too, haven't we heard the phrase that so-and-so made a bad decision or, quote, made a mistake? In other words, they acted upon something that wasn't accurate concerning a perception about reality. And the result was called a mistake. But what if there's no bad result? For consider the phrase that so-and-so is a codependent person. I once took a course on codependency, and there was an example given of a man who would from time to time go on an alcoholic bender and end up 2 a.m. in the clink, so to speak, and then give his wife a call to have her pick him up. And at one point in time, she refused to do this anymore, it being termed enabling to do so. It was said that he would have to pay the consequences so that he would learn, quote, a lesson. What kind of a lesson? About reality. That there were consequences in terms of pain, at least to someone else, if not himself, for certain acts, based upon his perceptions of reality, or the feedback thereof. Now also, a kingpin topic in sales theory and marketing in general is you have to know your customers' pain points. You need to know what they love and what they hate, basically. And there's then debate. Do you want to market to bring up their pleasure level or minimize their pain level? But the question again, how much pain do so many people not have on a regular basis, that is, except for little crises or mini crises here and there? And why might that be? My ultimate question along these lines, then, is are there so many ways built into our lives of what you might call being enabled, of not paying any kind of consequences to our actions based on a perception of reality or what have you? Is there often thus very little to feel pain of anymore? It kind of reminds me of that movie that came out, 10, 15 years ago called The Giver. Jeff Bridges was in it, for instance, the actor. And most everybody in this futuristic society, it was said, are kind of zoned out on some kind of drugs administered to them and required to be taken. And everything was fairly copacetic and numbed. The question being, of course, is that an optimal way of living? But at any rate, whatever perceptions of reality were there or not there had no consequence as to pain, because the pain was disconnected from any perceptions, right or wrong, about reality and actions upon it. So, for instance, there's much talk in the past 10, 20 years, I'd say, that so-and-so is abusing the welfare system, or they're on a free ride. Others will say, oh, so-and-so is, quote, lazy and getting away with it, or, quote, getting away with murder, and they're, quote, not playing fair. They're being implied or stated openly that there are no consequences then. And thus, why should we play by the rules or, quote, be moral when others might not and get off, quote, scot-free? Enabled, if you will, or where are the consequences, we ask, along then with the overall feeling of how unfair life is or seems to be when we stick to the line, so to speak, play fair. Some others don't, and they seem to, quote, do just fine as to no big consequences, we say. So we may throw up our hands and say, well, if you can't beat them, why not join them? But of course, there are those who say, well, maybe our earth is doing so ailingly poor now. Why might that be? Seems to me more and more that's because perhaps too many people are not suffering in the short-term consequences, and things are just slowly unraveling or fizzing out. For consider, in past years, I don't know, 100 years ago, if you had debts you couldn't pay, you would go to, quote, debtor's prison. And, of course, you were not going to be released until theoretically you had paid your debts off. There wasn't such a thing, basically, as bankruptcy. You would go to the, quote, workhouse. Now, fair, not fair, any discussions at all of this seem to me to beg the point that today bankruptcy is very easy to obtain. I would also say, as per how to sleep at night in a physiological state that is appropriate, call this housing. More and more these days, if one doesn't work, so to speak, or do anything at all to obtain such in a proper manner, one can always obtain these accommodations free of charge. Free room and board, thus, whether it's at your local prison, psych hospital, or, quote, homeless shelter, what have you. And I guess some would call this welfare. Others not. Others calling it simply an enlightened society. So if I didn't mention, too, there's the phrase subsidized housing. Yet another very prevalent, I believe, way of not experiencing consequences to a mishapped view of reality is to be able to blame shift the consequences of one's actions upon others by claiming the other people simply have bad genetics or a bad set of biochemistry in general, and that thus the pain they experience is not at all due to us, but due to their bad genetics. Then I kind of leave this till last, but not least. Since 1951, when Thorazine was stumbled upon as a drug, the first very powerful major tranquilizer, it was called, later relabeled as a antipsychotic, Seems to me that was the beginning of a new era in mankind, spreading more and more through the whole world then. Very powerful brain-numbing agents with fewer and fewer side effects engineered through a multiplicity of such drugs as time went on. And so, with fewer and fewer instances of excruciating pain, physical but mental also, what impetus is there then to do much of anything as time goes on, or to save in the larder, so to speak, for future emergencies and shortages in general? What impetus is there to keep the system well oiled, call it the infrastructures of life, including our own bodily health, if there are fewer consequences by far than before 1951, with what I call the first of a variety of zone-out drugs? For consider that Thorazine and such did not exist before not only 1951, but during the Civil War, say. And if you were hit by a rifle shot in the Civil War and the wound turned gangrene, the surgeon in a field hospital might want to cut your arm off, i.e. amputate. And you were lucky then if you had alcohol available to dull the pain. Otherwise you might be told to literally bite on a bullet while your arm was being sawed off. The anesthesia thus was rather crude, if not totally missing, in fact. So what kind of anesthesia agents might we find today? Well, there are some that knock you completely out and some that knock you partly out, while still walking and talking to an extent. You might even call them zombies or walking dead, but you might also call them individuals who are taking drugs that zone them out. Even the term I would coin med heads or pill heads. So these days then, if there were a civil war and we had buckshot in us or a wound, there would be anesthesia to put us out completely while surgery was being conducted, and something to numb us afterward, if not to the day we die, if needed. So with all of that then, what impetus would there be to correct our, quote, stinking thinking or bad premises or perceptions of reality that is incorrect in general, to minimize our chances of getting hit by a wound, so to speak, from a projectile in general, or anything in life? Or, alternatively, to shift how we interpret the wound and the pain to follow. Aren't thus many a psych drug, for instance, a option more and more utilized these days as a semi-anesthetic, without the massive downsides, at least in the short run, of alcohol or biting a bullet? You might also then draw analogies to childbirth before and after the first epidural to ease pain during childbirth, versus those who, even after such drugs came on the market, decided to, say, subscribe to a method such as Lamaze to have a, quote, natural childbirth. So, with more and more ways of evading consequences to poor reality aspects we perceive, I think this has contributed more and more to the advent of diabetes and heart disease and so on. Cancer, too. If there are no serious consequences to all of these, for instance, if you can simply go to the doctor's office, even in the outpatient setting sometimes, and have a toe lopped off or a foot taken off because of diabetic problems, stemming in part earlier on from misperception of reality, then what impetus is there, especially if Medicare or Medicaid are paying for the operation, to take measures to minimize this happening in the first place? All the more so if these numbing agents are called medicine to correct a so-called biochemical issue, the alternative being to say that they are correcting a mental issue called psychosis or delusion or stinking thinking, I would say, or limiting belief. Lies we tell ourselves, Chris Do says. Any which way you slice it. And of course, these numbing drugs not being the only way to evade or avoid consequences of a very painful nature to poor thinking, or the time also necessary to do quality thinking and review what we've thought. What about other forms, such as electroconvulsive therapy? It is said, others saying it can be carried so far as to fry your brain. Or you might say you have that option if lower levels of electricity do not accomplish the same zoning out process that chemicals could do, whether called meds or alcohol, say. And if ECT doesn't do it, and the, quote, psych drugs don't do it, there's always a surgical lobotomy, like, one of the siblings of a Kennedy member back in the 60s. I'm trying to remember her name. Rosemary Kennedy. A physical lobotomy was, quote, applied. Then, too, there's talk of how so many of man's major struggles and calamities have been solved, at least until your genetic package runs its course. So we have so many, quote, medicines today to manage what we call chronic illnesses. And we never do have to really go out and kill the cow anymore to eat. It's done for us by other workers, so to speak. And really, life has been solved as per its major problems all too often now. We call this advancement, but I wonder if it always is so. At any rate, though, take problems with tuberculosis in the not far back times, many a writer or artist succumbing to it, in fact. Other communicable diseases also dwindling in nature, at least in certain regions of the world. So once again, where are the consequences to poor grasps on reality? And in turn, if there's no consequences, doesn't that liberate all too many of us to be all the more certain without foundation of what we're claiming, making for a very confusing world as to what's up, what's down, what is reality, and what is not? How are we to know, ultimately, as Napoleon Hill said in his book, How to Own Your Own Mind, whether we're engaging in the pleasurable art of wishful thinking or not? If we have no bad consequences, once again, to wishful thinking. Of course, some say, more than some say, they are quite scared for the fate of their grandchildren, wondering if the Earth will be around in another 100 years, or as Stephen Hawking, the man who wrote A Brief History of Time, while in that wheelchair, a physicist, he urged us to get off the planet within the next 1,000 years, or it would be too late. I would think, too, if we have a form of enabling that says, just chalk it up on the roster of something to be paid someday, such that there's no consequences now to significant degrees, that is, I think, part and parcel of what some are concerned of about Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security one day drying up. Costs being pushed to future generations or to other countries in general. I say all this over and over again because it strikes me it is so commonplace to see all of us, or a lot of us, be quite more certain that we're right or that our wishful thinking is right because of a lack of consequences to incorrect thinking. So we can say whatever we want all the more these days, and who's to criticize on the basis of results what is correct or what is not, and on the basis of logic, who has the time or even intellect to delve into perceiving correctness or incorrectness of claims through logical examination. It's easier to judge the merits of an argument by whether or not it has bad consequences than it is sometimes to examine it on the basis of logic alone. I would think perhaps for society or world in general, this pushing off of reality will take a toll in the long run. And how interesting then that someone might say, well, that's not my concern. Let the future generations worry about it. I'm not going to burn in hell or, quote, go to heaven, and so what's the point? And so that is what I'm pondering these days as to why it is so easy to see a number of people being quite certain and yet quite wrong in certain respects. The ultimate concept of where's the negative feedback.